Okay, I guess we can get going. Hello and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Abhijit Verkar. I'm the president and CEO at Avero Advisors. I want to do a quick introduction before we get into the presentation, and um, I want to thank NAHRO for giving us the opportunity to have this platform and talk about this very important topic today. A little background about who Avero is. We are an IT modernization company based in Tennessee. We do a lot of work with public housing authorities across the country. We're on the NIGP's Cybersecurity Practice Forum, and we were just awarded the best, one of the best workplaces to work in the U.S. by Inc. magazine. We're also on the Business Partners Council with NAHRO. Again, thankful for the opportunity to serve the industry through NAHRO today. We serve clients all over the country, public housing authorities, cities, counties, municipalities. We have a wide range of clients that we serve. My background is I've got 15 plus years providing IT consulting services to housing authorities across the country, anything from IT strategic planning, process redesign, helping you choose the right enterprise software, helping you move from one software to the other. The one thing we don't do is sell anyone's product. So we're completely independent, and the presentation you'll see today is from an independent lens in your best interest. My colleague today is Robert Kurnovich. He's a senior manager with Avero. Tons of experience in IT. He used to be a CIO for a city government, and is an expert in technology as it applies to cybersecurity and public housing specifically. What we want to talk about most today is how do you get beyond the blinking lights in the data center? You may have the right technology, you may have the right systems, but what do executive directors, CEOs, mayors, council members, what do you, the executive, need to know about cybersecurity so that your organization is safe? And the last couple of weeks have been ripe with cyber attacks, hacks, and I'm sure those large enterprises had their ducks in a row as far as having the right systems and software and hardware in place. So what's missing? That's the focus of today's presentation. I do want to point out that we truly believe that cybersecurity today goes beyond just hardware and software. And it is the executives, it is the executive directors, CEOs that are ultimately held responsible and face the press and their board members and citizens when hacks and breaches do happen. So with that, I wanna hand this off to Robert. Robert, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for participating. I appreciate your time. So let's go ahead and dive in. Maybe Avi, you can go back one slide. I want to lay the foundation.
Sit back. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Here you go.
there we go. So because we're speaking to you as executives and as leadership, we're talking about enterprise risk because this falls within your domain. And for those who aren't familiar with enterprise risk, there's a variety of different ways of defining it. I like to define it as this is a risk you're trying to mitigate that has a substantial influence on your organization, how you operate, and your mindset. Obviously, these are risks that are critical to your operations, and they do require executive level engagement. But one thing I want to point out, even though we're talking about risks, and especially cybersecurity risks, one of the benefits you get is risks don't always have to be a negative mindset. By managing and mitigating your risks, you can actually seize a lot of opportunities. And last year was a great example. If your cybersecurity was in a good place, you knew what your resources are, you knew what you can and cannot do technology-wise as an organization, it actually opened up a lot of opportunities for you to be able to take advantage of remote workforce or adding some additional technology into your PHA. So even though we're going to get into the some of the heavier discussions about the risks that you face with cybersecurity, let's also keep a mindset that the goal here is to give your organization opportunities to leverage the technology that you've already invested in. So our topic today is cybersecurity. This is not just data security per se. This is a mindset for proactive mitigation. And one of the reasons why this is very important for PHAs is because obvious liability. organizations usually have to decide, are they going to be risk taking or are they going to be risk averse? Well, when you come to operations such as a PHA, it doesn't really get more risk averse than this. So there's a high requirement, the high expectation that you protect your sensitive data. So as we go into this next slide here, I'd like to go ahead and we'll start with our first poll question. And we did set up these so that they will be anonymous. I know we're talking about a sensitive topic. Some of you may not be too inclined to answer questions that you think might reflect badly on your PHA, but these are done anonymously, and these aren't questions to point anything out specifically. This is to understand the mindset that you're facing right now at the executive level when you talk about these enterprise risks like cybersecurity.
Robert, I'm
All right.
assuming you can't see the results, can you?
Yeah, I can see the results. So it looks like, and the point of this is using email is a very common cyber attack vector. And what we've often seen in the past is just simply clicking on an email link or not following your instinct that something's not right about the email you're receiving. It was a common way for cyber attacks to occur within organizations. There really is no right or wrong answer to this. In my experience, if you're at the very confident level, you might be a little too confident because these risks are always varying and they're finding new ways to social engineer. But if you're down at the very concerned and unknown, then obviously you feel like you would need a little bit more cybersecurity education for your users. We'll talk about that in a little more detail. So thank you for the results on that. So where do we start? Go back to the next slide. There you go. Thank you. A lot of things are going on in here. So we're going to talk about some of the assumptions that we're going to make here. We're going to talk about what we're trying to focus on. I'm going to start with the feeding the risks portion of it. There is a real concern that complacency with your cybersecurity can set in with organizations that haven't experienced a cyber event. And unfortunately, you have to assume that you will have a cyber event. You can just look in the recent headlines of the past 24 hours to realize that cybersecurity incidents are affecting a great number of organizations. The largest ones usually make it into the news headlines. The smaller ones tend not to. So you will have a day that will come where you will probably have to execute either your disaster recovery plan, which we'll talk about, your incident response plan, or take a look at your business continuity plan and determine. There are a lot of bad actors out there who will spend a lot of time and effort and gather resources to steal your data. My concern with PHAs is the vast amount of sensitive data that a PHA has by default. It makes you especially prone. If you're talking about the financial data that you collect, personal information, possibly medical information, your own financial information, bad actors could very easily target a PHA, and if the cybersecurity is not robust enough, there could be a serious compromise of data. And obviously, no one wants to be in that position. So we're talking about a risk mitigation mindset, and risk mitigation is held from moment to moment. There simply isn't a way in cybersecurity today to just buy a piece of technology, turn it on and go, okay, we're good to go, we're secure. Unfortunately, that's not the case for a variety of reasons, mostly because the resources that these bad actors and hackers can put together is massive, especially if this is backed by a foreign government. So you have to deal with the fact that the risks are going to change slightly in terms of the attack vectors they're going to try and get to you. You have to be mindful of maintaining what you do have, possibly be looking at some new solutions as attack vectors change. So again, moment to moment, never get to a place where you feel that you can be complacent about that. We're going to assume that your physical security is in good shape and it's in a mature stage. We are going to focus a little bit on change management, but this works best if there's already a culture of change management. What I mean by change management is planning and documentation. What we find in a lot of cases when we go into this organization is the documentation is either out of date, there's multiple versions of it, so people don't know which one is the correct one, or it's just not there at all. So there has to be this mindset of we're going to document and then keep those documents fresh and keep them actionable. Compliance, I don't even really need to speak about. As a PHA, you fully understand compliance. And your existing resources, I think you're going to be surprised. You likely own almost all the tools that you need to be successful at this. So let's talk about these questions. And again, ask these to yourself and see if you know the answer. Use this as sort of a milepost as to where you think you might be in terms of your cybersecurity when you're looking at it at an executive level. Number one, we've already asked through the poll question. And this is not only a vector for cyber attacks, this is also a vector for fraud. So especially in larger organizations, I'm sure we've all heard about issues where someone received an email asking for banking information and it appeared to be an executive inside the organization, or someone sends an email out posing as an employee of your PHA saying, can you please cut a check to this vendor, and hoping that the person's not going to use the controls in place, or just the suspicion that they have that this might not be right. Let me pick up the phone and call and verify this. So not just cyber attack, but also dealing with fraud in general. Now, data loss, when we talk about data loss, we tend to think in prior years strictly of backup, your data backups. But really, data loss expands now into not only your backup system working correctly and has it been stress tested, but what about employees who could be taking your data off site, either on purpose or accidentally? And data loss can also be ransomware, where you still have your data, but it's been encrypted by the ransomware, and it's very difficult for you to get it back. Hopefully you can restore from a good clean backup. Otherwise, you might have to pay a ransom. That's not a very straightforward process, or an exchange. We'll talk about that coming up as well. And then number three, this seems like a ridiculous question. Would you be okay with suspending your PHA's operations for a month or two? And I think almost everyone in here would say no. But the point is, on a lot of these recovery operations for organizations who haven't been prepared, it can take a month or two for you to get your systems back and up and running. And this happens a lot. It's more common than you probably think, and it's a disturbing trend. So we want to focus on the business continuity, making sure you provide the solutions to your organization to be able to mitigate an ongoing issue and get you recovered quickly. And again, like I said, existing tools, you probably own a lot of what you need. You've probably made purchases in the past 15 to 18 months. One thing you need to do is make sure that those are actually fully implemented. So your IT team, and we're not here to beat up on your IT team. They are just as busy as everyone else, and like a lot of your departments, they're being asked to do more with less. They tend to be under-resourced, stretched thin, especially in the smaller PHAs. You might not even have an IT staff. One of the things that we see is, like a lot of other departments you have, when that situation occurs, it's very easy to become complacent, especially if you've never had a cyber event, or at least one that you know of. And we can talk about the fact that sometimes you can have a data loss or a data theft, but because you don't have the tools in place to track that, you don't even know that you've been compromised. It's very easy in that type of environment to become desensitized to risk. It's also easy to take shortcuts that at the time you think have little consequence. Well, I haven't tested my backup procedure in 3 or 4 months, but last time I did a file restoration, it seemed to work okay, so I'm not going to worry about it. But you still need to do a robust testing of your disaster recovery. And unfortunately, in some cases, we've had IT departments that just outright abuse the trust that's been placed into them in exchange for reduced workload. They either want you to just think everything is okay, or they tell you everything's okay, but they're doing that because they just don't have the time and resources to really dive into cybersecurity that they want. But really, if you look at the right side of the screen, a lot of times your IT department is screaming out for help internally, but they're just either too fearful to ask. They might think it's embarrassing to ask for the resources. but they are just as concerned as you are about cybersecurity, and they really would like to get that resolved. So what we're talking about today is an executive level way for you to be able to set up your IT department to be successful at dealing with cybersecurity. All right, so how does this work, that information we're presenting to you? So because this is at the executive level, you already understand risk mitigation concepts. You're dealing with it on a regular basis and in a variety of areas. So that is the foundation we can very easily start with. I want to focus on you asking these questions now internally rather than waiting for external sources to start asking you this. So whether it's the public or a newspaper, or even HUD comes around and wants to know why did you have the cybersecurity event, or have you been actually backing up your data, protecting your data, encrypting your data? And in the worst case, you don't want to wait until an outside lawyer or an investigator shows up and wants to check on your cybersecurity operations. So it's very important, ask these questions now, ask them internally, and get those resolved and avoid embarrassment or the discomfort of having to deal with that. And again, it's also like the headline test, right? If you step to the microphone and you have to answer hard questions about, we didn't have policies and procedures in place. We never told our employees that they can't use USB drives. That can also put you in an embarrassing situation that can be easily avoidable. So we know we're talking about a technical topic here, but we're going to put this in a digestible format. And the idea here is you don't even have to know how to use a computer. This is just built upon the fundamentals of enterprise risk, focused more on technology and building this high-level framework. Most importantly, if you're asking questions in your organization and you don't like what you hear or you're not sure, hire an expert, get some help. So when we look at evaluating IT enterprise risk, especially because of PHA operations, this is the framework that we use. We start with the defined scope of this enterprise risk, which is pretty standard in the industry. We also apply the NIST standards, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. That gives us some industry standard protocols and guidance. We marry that with HUD and their security standards and compliance requirements. You therefore now have your criteria that you can now do an evaluation against the existing resources that you have. And it's important to be honest about that evaluation. Do a snapshot of where your organization is right now. Don't let well, we're about to, or we're almost there, or we're thinking about creep into your evaluation. Have an honest evaluation about where you are today. That's the best way to mitigate those risks. And after you do that evaluation, you can now lead into your action steps and determine how you're going to resolve those issues, mitigate your future risks, and then set up a plan for doing this on a fairly regular basis. And again, understanding you're very busy and you're probably understaffed, and this is the last thing you want to take on. But being proactive about this and making this a cultural mindset in your organization actually helps it to not become any sort of a burden or an additional overhead on your staffing needs and your operations. So on risk severity levels, this is just a quick reference. When we talk about risk severity levels, these are the categories we tend to use. Today, we're focusing on the high-level framework for items that either have a very high impact, tremendous liability, or very likely to occur. That's the only things we will be talking about today. So let's dive into this, this framework, and let's look at the high level, these key areas, and what you as an executive or leader in your organization can do to make your organization and your IT department successful. So incident response plan, what makes this different from the other plans we're going to talk about is that this is for something that is in progress. You are experiencing a cyber event, or you've had a natural disaster and it takes out your data center or suspends your technology operations. This is a common failure that we see. If an organization does have a response plan, it hasn't been updated in a while, it doesn't reflect personnel changes. You hire a network engineer, that person leaves the organization. Maybe you don't fill that position as a network engineer, you fill it as something else. And your incident response plan doesn't reflect that. Now, your IT department is busy, so they're not going to be able to sit down and put together a plan for every single possible cyber event. But the goal of this plan is you need to have the basics outlined, because if you try and plan things and put things together and determine resources in the middle of the incident, the confusion that you can have, or the inability to actually put your resources together in a defined way, can make not only major data loss inevitable, but it's going to substantially increase the time it's going to take for you to mitigate that and then go to restoring your operations. So this doesn't have to be a 20, 30, 40 page plan. It does need to cover the basics though. You need to outline who would be available to participate in an incident response, what their roles would be, determine a communication plan. How are you going to communicate with executive? How are you going to communicate with your board that you report to? And figure this all out in advance. It benefits IT departments immensely, because you don't have to stop and try and put that together when you're in the middle of this. You can immediately start to take action, and everyone knows what their basic role is. You also have to remember that in some cases, such as like a natural disaster, if you have a flood or an earthquake, your IT department might not be able to show up. The entire IT department might not be able to show up on site. So you have to factor in that you might be bringing in someone else and handing them a piece of paper that describes what their role is, because you thought in your head that, well, when this happens, all I have to do is bring in my 3 database analysts and my network engineer. You have to assume that some of those might not be available, especially with a regional natural disaster. So it's important to plan out those types of things, and not necessarily the technical details of what exactly am I going to do with the cybersecurity attack that starts with ransomware in email. So we're not diving into details on this. We're allowing you to be able to plan this advance, so if something does happen, you can quickly focus on what needs to be focused on and get everything mitigated quickly. And with the disaster recovery plan, I wanted to point out that these 2 types of plans and some of the other ones we're going to talk about really do need to be updated on a regular basis. I'm going to emphasize that several times, because this is a common finding. And especially with the disaster recovery plan, which this is after the incident has been mitigated. Now you're trying to restore your technology services and resume your operations. These types of plans have to be practiced as well. Mostly because first time you practice these, you're going to be surprised. You're going to discover that your plan has some flaws. What this does is this gives you the ability to address those flaws. Also gives the ability, if you haven't tested in a while, to make sure that your disaster recovery plan reflects what your current infrastructure is. You might have done some purchasing of some new technology in the past 6 months, which makes your existing disaster recovery plan either inadequate or not useful at all. So, and again, with this, and as well as the incident response plan, if you don't plan a lot of this out in advance and define some of the general roles, you could lead to a situation where data is likely to be unrecoverable, and you do not want to be in that position. The other thing is, with the mistakes that can be exacerbated by not having this planned out in advance, you could inadvertently cause the data loss on yourself. You could very much make a mistake in the heat of the moment when you're trying to get everything up and running, and cause something that means now your systems are completely unrecoverable. So, and the key on this one too is also make sure you engage your stakeholders. Make sure the leaders in your departments, your workflow managers, your process owners, that they have some sort of involvement as well, so they know what a recovery would look like and would mean to them. So a common question is, how do I know if I need to spend $5,000, $50,000, $150,000 a year on disaster recovery tools and cybersecurity? This is where your business continuity plan comes into play and helps you answer those. So this isn't just a listing of what you do as an organization. This is a document where you determine what your priorities are and what you're looking to do. This lays the groundwork for actually building a lot of the other things we discuss in cybersecurity, especially your incident response plan and your disaster recovery plan. And this actually is a great document that you can then use for your budgeting needs going forward when you're looking at your annual budgets. This is another one that we tend to see as being underdeveloped or hasn't been updated in a while. Again, include key stakeholders and process managers in this. Your IT department needs some direction as to what is the priority when we're talking about resuming your operations or getting you up and running. And that helps just drive decision points that they make on the technological side. And if you don't have a good business continuity plan that addresses what your priorities are as an organization and what you're looking to do, your incident response plans will fail, your disaster recovery plans will fail, and things down the line will also fail as well. And sometimes you're going to not be able to answer the question of why did we spend this much money on this, or why did we not spend enough? So business continuity plan helps bring a lot of that together, especially at the executive level, which can then trickle down to these other things that we're talking about. And it's also important to define in those three plans what your expected downtime is. That's another budgeting decision that I wanted to point out. You know, if you're a large PHA, you have a lot of public engagement, you're really leveling your technology for that public engagement. A couple of days of downtime might not be acceptable to you. A couple of minutes of downtime might not be acceptable to you. So in those situations, and especially if you have the funding, you might be okay with funding your disaster recovery tools and your cybersecurity tools to ensure that your downtimes don't exceed more than a few seconds or a few minutes. If you're a smaller PHA, you don't have the funding available for that, you're okay with being down for 1 day, then that defines a different set of price standards when you come to budgeting and planning for your disaster recovery, prevents you from overbuying or underbuying as to what your organization needs. So documented policies and procedures, without these, your cyber strategy is really ineffective. This is another area where we see documentation, but it tends to be out of date. It doesn't reflect changes in technology within the organization. In some cases, it's just too much. It's hundreds and hundreds of pages, and therefore it's very difficult for your staff to be able to digest, let alone practice. And so it's important to remove conflicting versions of this because that tends to happen as well. But more importantly, it's without guidance, your employees don't know if they're making the right decision or not. Some of them might abuse that to some extent. And there's no support there for audit or legal action. You know, if you need to take legal action against someone for stealing your data or violating policy, well, if you don't have the policy there in place or it's not well defined, it's very difficult to take that. So one of the executive level questions is, do you know of, off the top of your head, a current comprehensive source for all of your technology policies? And surprisingly, a lot of organizations don't, or that hasn't been looked at in a while. So like these other plans, needs to be updated and addressed on a regular basis. So vendor security. Now, whether you've bought a product that you're using on premises, that you've installed actually on your infrastructure, or you're going to hosted solutions like a lot of organizations are now, it's very important to set your standards and expectations up front. And I recommend you do that in the procurement process. If you try to apply vendor security, your expectations, what you are being held to in terms of compliance, you try to apply that after the fact, after you've already signed the agreement, very, very difficult, if not impossible to do. And why do we do this? Because vendors can be a vulnerability for you as well. So what we recommend is make sure you state all your requirements up front, hold your vendors accountable to that by using your technology tools to audit their security as it applies to your environment, and then hold them accountable for that. You just don't want to assume that because they're a software company, then they should know everything about security. You just can't afford to make that assumption. There's too much vulnerability and there could be too much surprise. So as we talked about with our first poll question, cybersecurity education plays a major role on the user portion of that. If your users are not educated in how to recognize suspicious emails or learn how to avoid habits that might lead to a security vulnerability, it's very difficult for them to actually apply that. And cybersecurity education also should marry perfectly with your documented policies and procedures. Now, because you're a PHA and you're likely doing PII training for all of your employees, this is something that should already be familiar to your employees. But the goal of this is, on top of that, layer the ability to provide current information for current trends that security experts are seeing in terms of new cyber attack vectors, instead of waiting for HUD to publish some new information. And your IT department can take a look at their help desk trends and determine, are we seeing a trend here that we need to mitigate through user education? But this is something that should be married with your compliance that you're already doing internally, gives you a robust training program, and most of all, look for something that's engaging. I think we'd all been through cybersecurity test questions where after the 10th or the 11th wasn't very engaging. We're not going to remember the content. 5 minutes after we look at it, we go back to our old habits. So make sure it's something that's engaging, that you keep current, and that you solidify across the organization. Because you also want to make sure that whatever information you're providing in your cybersecurity education to your employees actually reflects policies and procedures that executive level leadership is willing to stand behind. This is another thing that we see where someone puts cybersecurity education in front of users but hasn't cleared it with the executive level. Executive starts to get a lot of questions as to, I didn't know we were supposed to do this, and why am I being instructed to do that? Make sure you work with executive ahead of time and determine an overall strategy before you deploy cybersecurity education. So actually I wanted to take a moment here and let's jump into our second poll question that we have and give you a chance to answer. There's also a good chance that many of you have never even asked this question or have been asked this question. That is not uncommon either. And it's usually not until you've had your first cyber event or natural disaster or something that does shut down your operations for a period of time. That's when the question usually gets asked for the first time. And so looking here at the poll results, 1 business week, 6 to 12 hours, and again, this can vary from organization to organization. We understand that if you're a smaller PHA, your funding is very, very limited. And like I said, you might not even have an IT department. But it's important to define these from the get-go, because again, this drives your budget decision. This also can be used as a benchmark to determine, am I actually able to make that goal? Do I have what I need to prevent from being down for an entire week or an entire month? And really can be used as a guidepost for how to maximize your resources, especially if they're very limited resources or your limited staffing. It's a great guide, and again, a question that usually is not asked until you're in a serious event. So as we talked about towards the beginning, you likely own the tools that you need for cybersecurity. And utilizing existing features varies from the basics of, are you applying regular patches to your workstations, which is a common attack vector for cybersecurity incidents. But it also means, are you keeping old technology around? Old technology either is not supported by your vendor, doesn't have any updatable security features because it's been retired by, let's say you're using Windows 7 or an older operating system. If you don't even have the ability to take advantage of patching features because Microsoft doesn't support your operating system, you're leaving yourself wide open. Microsoft releases a lot of patches. They're targeted to deal with known or potential issues. And if your operating system no longer is supported by Microsoft and they're not providing you patches, the vulnerability that they discover, they're not going to be able to offer a solution for you, and you're left wide open and vulnerable. This also extends into other areas like intrusion protection. A lot of networking devices or new infrastructure that you purchase has these features to some degree that can be turned on, used to gather information or do some dashboard reporting to your IT department so they can keep track of what's going on your network. It's very comfortable in terms of your operations and IT to just go without this, because a lot of IT organizations look at the information they get from security features as being a lot of noise and a lot of overhead. But the liability that you run by not employing them, not knowing if you've been hacked, not knowing why your servers just shut down or that all your files on your hard drive and your network drives are encrypted, um, not only puts you in an embarrassing situation, but if you don't know how to put your arms around the event that's occurring to you because you don't have any information from logs or from your firewall per se, it's almost impossible to figure out how to mitigate the situation and stop it. So this stretches from the very basics of, I've got a brand new laptop. Am I maintaining it by my IT department doing regular maintenance and patching, all the way to higher level, more advanced networking options. If you don't have these features, there are a lot of affordable solutions. One of the benefits of the pandemic has been that technology in a lot of ways has actually become more available at a lower cost. Now, if you have a very limited budget, to you, that might not mean very much, but it does allow you to engage on things that before were sort of seen as enterprise level cybersecurity. And now these are things that are a lot more affordable and available to smaller organizations. So this one tends to fail because you have the solutions, you haven't either brought them to maturity, or you've implemented them once and never revisited them to make sure that they're properly maintained. You might be having your workstations patched automatically, but if no one's checking to see if that patching is actually working correctly and that they really are patched, ignorance is not bliss in this particular situation. So because we're talking about a defined set of standards, especially with the NIST standards, there's a lot of technical detail that goes inside of those. But the idea that we have here is that this is the framework that you need to make those processes down the line successful. So when you get into the more technical aspects of these standards, in order for that to be successful, to be implemented correctly, for you to be able to buy the right thing, you need this high level framework that we've discussed here. So there's always further reading that can be done if you're interested, but we want to we want to make sure that the framework we're talking about here is at least established in your organization, and that'll help you quite a bit going forward in maintaining your cybersecurity posture. So the takeaways here, like we talked about at the beginning, cybersecurity is a major enterprise risk, but you have to look at the aspect that it also gives your organization a lot of options, even in the terms of collaboration with another organization for data sharing or programs that you're involved with other organizations. If you have solid cybersecurity, you know what your IT resources are, you know what kind of state they're in. It's very easy to take advantage of situations that pop up, rather than, I'm not sure if we can do that. We don't know if we have the ability to manage a connection like that or bring someone on board, or even hire a new vendor because we haven't established our security standards with them. So this is about giving your organization options. Documentation. If it's not documented, it just doesn't exist. So your cybersecurity plan might be in your head, and you might have an idea of what that's going to look like, of what you need to do. If you had a major server failure, if your data center flooded, you need to document that. And there's always the possibility that if you're an IT leader, What if you're not available because of the natural disaster to be on site to help restore your operations? And now one of your IT supervisors or technicians now has to try the disaster recovery. If you don't have it documented in some place that's easily accessible, they're not going to know what to do at all. And they're likely just going to let the incident continue going forward unmitigated. Whereas if they had the documentation and some sort of a plan, or at least knew who to call for a particular resource, they could actually start mitigating the situation. So cost effective, because a lot of what we talked about, you probably own to some degree. All it needs to do is be brought to maturity. And if you don't have it, there are a lot of solutions out there that can be implemented without blowing up your budget, blowing up your IT department, making you have to go out and hire 2 or 3 new IT people, which is probably not even an option for most PHAs. So there are a lot of cost-effective solutions. And don't ever think that I'm just too small to have to worry about cybersecurity. I don't have an IT department, so I don't have to worry about it. Or, I hired a software vendor that said they're going to take care of everything for me. At the executive level, you still need to be engaged in that and make sure that that's occurring. But the goal here is to give you solutions that are actionable, that aren't going to require you to go through another budget cycle to put together a lot of money, or go out and get additional resources or increase your staffing. Again, we're talking about enterprise risk. It just, not thinking about it just doesn't get better with age. Bad news doesn't get better with age. And if you ignore this enterprise risk or don't address it, like all of your other enterprise risks in your organization, your culpability and your liability keep growing overnight. And especially because the risk hasn't gone away, it just isn't being looked at. So again, infrastructure security is about mitigating enterprise risk. It's not building complacency. I don't want to leave you with the idea that all I have to do is buy this and implement that, and I'm good to go for the next 5 years. This is something that always has to be proactively looked at.
All right, Robert. I think we have some questions in the chat box that I'm gonna bring up, and let's try and answer them. So the first one is the vendor security question. And the question is, does that also apply to non-software vendors who might interact with your software?
Yes, because nowadays, when you bring in a vendor, you're almost always giving them access to some sort of your resources, which are usually technology based. So even if it's just email, if you give them a card key to be able to get in and out of your building. Not every single vendor is going to have that type, but you need to go in with the mindset of, I need to make sure that I check the boxes and make sure that I am not providing them with any technology or access into my systems. And if I am, then I need to make sure that I'm upfront with them about the expectations and the security. And again, don't just assume that because they're a vendor, they're going to take care of it themselves, or that everything's going to be okay. You have to be proactive about making sure that you're not exposing your resources to them and increasing your liability.
Okay. Next one is a comment more than a question. It says the downtime acceptable or that can be handled the most is 24 hours. I don't think we had an option between 12 hours and 1 week, so that's fair. Um, Question two is about cybersecurity insurance. How much does that impact what we just presented, and is that a fair avenue for mitigating cyber risk?
So cybersecurity insurance, our cyber insurance, I highly recommend organizations look at it. There's a lot of detail in there. It varies from organization to organization. It is a values judgment because it's, there's a cost there. So you have to determine, do you want to mitigate that risk, that the potential payout you'd have to do to either pay a ransom, which we do not recommend that you do, but in some cases you might not have a choice, or the additional resources you would have to buy to shore up your systems after a cybersecurity breach. It's too detailed and specific to an organization to give you a blanket answer, but I encourage organizations to look at it and see what their options are. And if they feel that that is in their best interest to mitigate a high substantial cost, through a values judgment on their part, then seriously look at it and make sure you get a good product. But if it's something that you have another avenue or you have the capability of self-insuring, which most places don't, but if you do, then you wouldn't necessarily need it. But I encourage every organization to take a look at it and see what their options are.
Next question, Robert, is about penetration testing, um, and if that is also an important tool in shoring up your cybersecurity posture.
It is. What usually happens, though, is it's hard to get consensus at the executive level on the penetration testing for a couple of reasons. First of all, it can be intrusive into your systems. It can disrupt ongoing operations, so it's important to plan it for most of that to occur after hours. Um, a lot of organizations don't like the fact that it's going to expose a lot of things, especially if your penetration testing is also paired with a social engineering test. And some organizations are doing this where IT department purposely sends out a potentially um, ransomware loaded email to see how many people in the organization will click on it. My experience has been it's very difficult to get all your department directors to sign off on the fact that you're going to be exposing weaknesses either through user operations, user habits, as well as IT. I highly recommend it though, because there's just no substitute for that. You really need someone on the outside to do a full analysis of trying to get into your network to determine just how vulnerable you are. There just isn't a substitute for it. But the issues tend to be on the political side more than the procurement and the technological side of actually running penetration testing.
Yeah, and also the universe of um, combinations that a pen test can test for are very limited. Unless you have a pen test ongoing all the time, you really are not testing every scenario that might happen to your organization. So, good points, Robert. Next question is, how would you ensure that your external IT company is providing the right amount of security for your PHA?
So if you don't have the resources to manage that internally, and a lot of PHAs don't, um, you're going to have to engage someone else to help you with that. I understand that vulnerability, and it occurs as well with your own internal IT department. You know, this is your staff. You place a lot of trust in them, and you feel that you don't have either the technical understanding or the reason to question a lot of their habits. But even just asking the questions and really pressuring your external resources to answer questions about security or at least be able to explain it to you, you're not going to be able to detect it most of the time, but you should be able to use the risk management skills you have as an executive to go, I might not understand what they're talking about technically, but something's not right in the answers that we're getting. And especially in that case, engage another expert to help you out or to be involved in that. But if you suspect that something isn't right, you really need to look into it, because you don't have to have a technical understanding to think conceptually and go, things aren't adding up here. Things don't seem correct. We need to verify that this external partner is actually providing us ways to mitigate risk, not increasing our risk through their services.
And also the external IT company also is a lot of external factors today because of work from home, pandemic situations. There's a lot of traffic coming in to your core networks that isn't in your building. So it goes hand in hand with what Robert just said. Is you just have to look at it from a holistic perspective. The next question is, what kind of policy against spoofing and staff direction regarding the receipt of such emails do you usually suggest? And this goes back to spoof emails that people may click on that opens the doors to hacks and cyber events. Robert?
So yeah, so this is where cybersecurity education can really pay off, because in most organizations, when you try to update your policies and procedures on a regular basis, it leads to burnout, unfortunately. It doesn't feel like you're keeping up because it tends to have to go through a review process, at least at executive level, before your policies and procedures, an updated version, hits your organization for them to start actually looking at it and implementing. And that's not an excuse not to keep that updated. It's just a recognition that the process does take a long period of time. Cybersecurity education fills that in for you. If you at least educate the users to, hey, there's a new trend that they're using in social engineering through email to try and get you to go to a website or click on a link or provide your password, your cybersecurity education is your best bet to mitigate that up front and then let your policies and procedures catch up. And especially if you're noticing, years ago, we didn't think that a USB device would necessarily be any sort of a threat to cybersecurity. But that obviously was not the case when ways were found to either compromise that, to either load information onto a thumb drive that you then send to someone, you send to an HR department and say, you know, here, please take a look at my resume. And that's actually a program that someone put on the USB stick. They plug it into the HR director plugs it into his or her computer and then launches a ransomware attack. So those types of things will evolve quickly and they will change. Address that in your cybersecurity education first, and then allow your policies and procedures to address that if it isn't addressed in your policies and procedures.
Thanks, Robert. The next one's about, is there a best of breed software that can help us mitigate a lot of these risks? Is there one piece of software or something you might recommend?
There isn't. I've yet to see it in the organization or in the industry yet, and I don't think we're going to quite get there because the beauty of the innovation that we have with the variety of tech companies out there is they tend to make leaps over one another in terms of their advancement in what they provide and in the security they provide. So it would be difficult to go with one. SolarWinds obviously, unfortunately, has a little bit of a tarnished name right now. It's a good product. It's very robust. If you don't have a central center for managing all your data logs, all your help desk, all your software inventory, all the management of your technology, policies and procedures. But because of the hack that occurred last year, the SolarWinds name can be looked at as being potentially suspicious. That's because a targeted attack was directed at them, and it was very difficult for them to mitigate that because of the resources put on there. So it's still a very good product. There are even some basic products out there that if you are still doing a manual inventory of your computer systems, there are a number of really good products that you can purchase for a couple $100 that can automatically inventory every device on your network, return error logs back to you, and tell you if there's any vulnerabilities that it finds. And so because this varies from month to month as new products and services come out, you're probably going to want to engage an expert to help give you some guidance on that. But it's difficult to name one single platform because of the innovation that a variety of people are providing to their products and services.
Next question is, how do you go about educating your staff about threats and risks?
So it needs to be, I think the most common thing is cybersecurity education. When it does occur, it occurs once a year, twice a year, and especially when it's time to get everyone in the organization certified again with PII compliance, that they've been through their education. And that just doesn't work, because again, you watch the video, you answer the questions, and then 5 minutes later, you don't retain that, or you go back to your old habits. So there really needs to be a consistent outreach, which also helps with your resourcing as well. If you're training staff every week, if you're lucky enough to be able to do that, or every couple of weeks or every month in cybersecurity education, you can go into smaller, manageable bites with them. And there's even simple things like your IT department putting out a newsletter that users can just look at and go, oh, I see that there's a new cyber attack vector that's coming out. Your users aren't thinking in that terms, but they're looking at it and going, oh, I see there's a new method for someone to try and hack and get my password. Um, Even if it's just an outreach newsletter, at group meetings, department meetings, having your IT department come by and just spend 2 minutes talking about something. But consistency and having it on a regular basis is the best way to deploy your cybersecurity education so that it's effective. You don't want to overwhelm the end user with 2 hours of training every 6 months, but 5 to 10 minutes every week, every other week can go a long way into getting them engaged and getting them to where you need to be in terms of being less vulnerable.
Next one is how do we humanly monitor all of the what's going on the internet and what's coming into our networks?
It's difficult to do because you don't have the resources to look at absolutely everything that can be provided to you in information. This is not just in cybersecurity. This is just in general and in our way of life these days. You can very easily bombard it with information. You get desensitized to it. It's difficult to manage it. So what a lot of these programs, and if you own an IT help desk system for managing your tickets, it probably has a module that's able to take all of your logs that you're getting from your network devices and compile them into something useful. You can also set specific types of alert on your devices or your software that manages your logs, so that you're only going to get alerted if these particular things happen. Um, or in some situations, you just have to set aside some time for one of your network engineers to go through all the information and look for trends. But you're going to have to rely upon dashboarding systems that are built into a lot of security technology to provide you with that information and to serve it up to you, especially if your IT director wants to take something to executive and provide a report on internet usage, what people are looking at, how many hours people are logging in every day when they work remotely. You're going to have to rely upon a dashboarding tool to really compile that information. The good news is there's a lot of them. They're very effective. And if you spend a little bit of time, you can customize them to serve your exact reporting needs internally.
Okay, Robert, I think we're running out of time. We can't get to all questions, unfortunately, but we'll if you email us or contact us, we can get you answered. I do want to pick one question that came in. It says, "Is there hope?" And I'll answer that by saying yes. If you do more than just buy stuff that goes blinking red and green in your data centers. There's a lot that goes into cybersecurity that we've only scratched the surface of today. If you need more information, if you need help, please feel free to contact us. We'd be glad to talk to you. And once again, thank you, NAHRO, for the opportunity, for the platform. And again, if you need anything, this is how to reach us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.